All right, history 362. So after many delays due to windstorms, power outages, and our midterm, let's finally wrap up belatedly the Ptolemies, a kind of blow by blow down to around 200 BC. If I had to make a kind of generalization of sort of the Ptolemaic dynasty, its position, its place in the Mediterranean geopolitics, I would say that for the first half of the century, really down to the 240s, the Ptolemies are ascendant. They're quite likely the wealthiest, the best organized, maybe even the most powerful of the three Hellenistic dynasties. With their large navy, they project power deep into the Aegean. With their money, they engage in diplomacy. Indeed, they have probably one of the widest diplomatic webs of any of the Hellenistic kingdoms, at least in the Mediterranean. Something that, as we'll see, pays off for them in the long run. Despite this kind of golden age from the reign of, say, Ptolemy, the golden age is really the reign of Ptolemy II and Ptolemy III. The dynasty starts suffering real problems. Some of these are problems that are internal to the dynasty, poorly managed successions and regencies. Some also relate, the bigger problem ultimately relates to relations with the native Egyptian population, to the point that by the end of the 3rd century, we might say that the Ptolemaic kingdom is in some ways a failed state, ruled by a child, racked by dynastic intrigue, and suffering from a massive rebellion of native Egyptians. It's actually a bit jarring sort of to look at that kind of long century and see the Ptolemies go from seemingly kind of ascendant, the best organized, best financed, perhaps even the best army of all the Hellenistic kingdoms, to being this kind of smoking ruin of a kingdom, at least metaphorically, and in some instances physically as well. And of course, what we have to remember, I think always, is of all of the Hellenistic kingdoms, they're all going to go. The Ptolemaic kingdom lasts the longest. And so even when we talk about Ptolemaic weaknesses and moments of Ptolemaic sort of chaos, it's going to make it down to 31 BC, and it's going to outlast the Seleucids and way outlast the Antigonids. Ptolemy II succeeds his father in 282. It's a smooth succession because he's already been the king. He's already been crowned king for several years now. So he just continues doing what he's doing when his father dies. He does face one problem. There's one kind of breakaway, it's not quite a full-on rebellion, but there is one breakaway movement, and that is Cyrene. So Ptolemy I controls not just Egypt, but also the part of North Africa that is adjacent to Egypt. Cyrene is known for being good agricultural territory, good productive territory. And in 276, a sort of ancillary member of the royal family, the son of one of Ptolemy I's wives, but not the son of Ptolemy, named Megas, goes ahead and sets up shop for himself in Cyrene as a kind of breakaway kingdom. And the Ptolemaic dynasty is largely, despite some attempts, unable to subdue him. And of course, we should ask why. I mean, it's unclear that Cyrene has that much troops or military resources, although it is quite prosperous. And probably the best guess is this has to do with, again, a reluctance to mobilize a large army and march out of Egypt. Now, that being said, Ptolemy II does score some military victories. In victories we don't know that much about, but it seems, for all intents and purposes, that he wins the First and Second Syrian Wars against the Seleucid dynasty. The First Syrian War, again, we know almost nothing about, other than the fact that it takes place in the 270s. The Second Syrian War seems to be a much more kind of decisive victory. in that Ptolemy II is in a position to impose terms upon the Seleucids that, again, require the Seleucid king to divorce his wife, marry Berenike, the sister of, the daughter of Ptolemy II, the sister of the future Ptolemy III. And this, of course, therefore sort of inserts Ptolemaic genes into the Seleucid bloodline. This, of course, then immediately prompts the outbreak of the Third Syrian War. So Ptolemy II overall has a long and glorious reign. He dies in 246 BC. And again, he is indeed, as a king, is kind of associated with sort of the golden age of Ptolemaic power. When people look back in terms of the splendor of the culture, the wealth of the kingdom, the effectiveness of its military, Ptolemy II seems to be a bit of a high point. Although you might say that some, if you want to say, are there cracks showing? There do seem to be some, in that attempts to project power against the Antigonids, so the Seleucids, we might say, Ptolemy II does great. Against the Antigonids, he has some more mixed success. His attempts to support the rebellion of Athens in the Chremonidean War comes up short. And Antigonus Knatos inflicts 2 naval victories, or I guess from Ptolemy's perspective, naval defeats, at Andros and Kos in the 150s BC. So again, even in this kind of golden age, there are difficulties projecting primarily naval power against the Antigonids, despite the fact that Ptolemy II does pretty well against the Seleucids. But overall, we might say it's a high point. Now, Ptolemy III, who succeeds, his marriage, he does not engage in an incestuous marriage. He engages in an exogamous marriage. But the point of that exogamous marriage is to bring Cyrene back into the fold. So he marries the daughter of Megas, also named Berenike, and that marriage reconnects Egypt with Cyrene. And Cyrene, in some ways, represents kind of part of that kind of African core to the Ptolemaic kingdom. Now, we've talked about the Third Syrian War from the perspective of the Seleucids. I just want to reemphasize what a smashing success it is as a sort of manifestation of Ptolemaic power. The Ptolemies capture the Seleucid royal center and arguably the capital. It's where the royal tombs of the Seleucids are, Seleucia Pieria. And a Ptolemaic phalanx marches as far east as Babylon. This is, Alexander the Great level stuff in terms of the penetration of Ptolemaic armies deep into the heart of Asia and Mesopotamia. So the Third Syrian War, well, again, we wish we knew more about that war. It happens before we get the kind of military narrative of Polybius, but it really does represent the sort of apogee in many ways of Ptolemaic power. As I think I mentioned in an earlier lecture, though, Ptolemy III then abruptly withdraws. For a while, there was a garrison and even a governor in Babylon, but essentially with the withdrawal of the main Ptolemaic army, whatever Ptolemaic position there is in Asia collapses, allowing Laodice and her sons to reclaim the Seleucid Empire for that dynasty. But it seems that the reason that Ptolemy III leaves is precisely because there is some kind of unrest in Egypt. And this is the major problem of the Ptolemies. They have this incredible army around these sort of well-trained clerics, but they are basically committed to holding down Egypt, and they're afraid to deploy it elsewhere for fear that their own natives might rebel. So Ptolemy III finally dies in 221. This leads to the accession of Ptolemy IV, a young man married to his sister, Arsinoe, so back to incestuous marriages, or an incestuous marriage. And he has to now bear the brunt of the attack of a very, very energetic Seleucid king, Antiochus the Great. And what's notable is that while Polybius, who gives us his judgment, sees Antiochus the Great as this energetic and, at least in his youth, militarily effective king, and also one who is able to liberate himself from the control of his courtiers. Remember, Polybius gives us, in which we read, this dramatic narrative of Antiochus the Great ultimately murdering the overbearing courtier Hermias and really taking control of his court. Polybius suggests the opposite is happening in Egypt, and that Ptolemy IV is fully controlled by his courtiers and his high ministers, particularly his epiton pragmaton, Sosibus, and as a result, he's just sort of this weak, kind of bullied, lazy figurehead of a king. Now, it is interesting, however, that when these two kings meet, it's Ptolemy IV who wins the Battle of Raphia, when these two huge armies, roughly 150,000 men on both sides. Now, we're told that as Antiochus is invading, so in the prelude to the Battle of Raphia, as he's managed to capture Coele-Syria, he's managed to retake Seleucia, Pieria, and the Ptolemies stall for time so that they can raise a defensive army to defend Egypt proper. And we're told that most of these efforts are driven by Sosibus and high ministers. And so this includes some pretty standard things that you do if you're a Hellenistic king facing a military emergency. You try to hire all the mercenaries that you can. There's a bit of a problem about hiring mercenaries in wartime, though, right? Because when you're at war, the mercenary market, the demand for mercenaries automatically doubles. Not only are you hiring as many as you can, but your enemy is hiring as many as he can. And the invasion in 217 BC happens at maybe one of the worst possible times to hire mercenaries in the Mediterranean. Every single big kingdom and state is at war. The Seleucids and the Ptolemies are at war. The Antigonids, Philip V is at war with the Aetolians. And to make matters worse, across the way, Rome and Carthage are at war. It's hard to hire mercenaries in that environment. The market is strained. And so short of mercenaries in 217, a decision is made, probably by Ptolemy IV's ministers, to arm native Egyptians to fight as phalanx, as heavy pikemen in a Macedonian-style phalanx. Now, Polybius sort of gives us the impression that essentially they're taking civilian Egyptian peasants and arming them. But there has been some recent work, including by a scholar at USC named Christelle Fisher-Beauvais, who's argued that there always has been a kind of Egyptian component to the Ptolemaic army, although oftentimes it is somewhat paramilitary, that the Egyptians may not be serving as line infantry, but they may be serving as policemen, as paramilitary guards, as sailors, and even marines. And so it's not actually impossible that people who are armed as heavy Macedonian-style infantry are these kind of paramilitary kind of auxiliary staff who before might have been sort of lightly armed and now are being given long pikes and actually drilled to fight as part of a heavy pike phalanx. Now, it does seem that the fact that the Ptolemies, between the clerics that they mobilize and the 20,000 Egyptians that they mobilize, have a huge advantage in heavy pike infantry, phalangites, that seems to make a difference, and that what Polybius tells us, that the weight and mass of the Ptolemaic phalanx pushes back the Seleucid phalanx. Maybe the mechanics of that are actually kind of obscure, but it does seem that the numbers there matter, and the Egyptians are really decisive to the Battle of Raphia, which ends the Fourth Syrian War, a Ptolemaic victory. It actually also seems, paradoxically, that Ptolemy IV, who's otherwise just described as this lazy, worthless, maybe alcoholic king, not interested in policy, plays an important role in the battle in that he is initially with the cavalry, and the Ptolemaic cavalry is driven back by the energetic cavalry charge led by Antiochus the Great. And in fleeing, he rides down to the center and actually rallies his heavy infantry, who see him and also his sister, who is there with him, rallying the troops. And that sort of boosts the morale of the cleric and Egyptian infantry that then go and attack and defeat the Seleucid phalanx. So whatever else he does at this decisive battle, Ptolemy IV has a real moment where his presence does seem to actually substantially inspire the Ptolemaic troops. Now, we're told, however, that after the Battle of Raphia and the peace that's ratified, and it does seem, and this is an observation made by a scholar named John Grangier, that once two kings make a peace, it holds for the lifetime of those kings until one of them dies, and then the war can break out again. So it's notable that the war breaks out as soon as the Third Syrian War breaks out as soon as Ptolemy the Second is dead. The Fourth Syrian War breaks out as soon as Ptolemy the Third is dead. And now that Ptolemy the Fourth has made a peace with Antiochus, that peace will hold while they both live. That does seem to be the pattern. Therefore, with the sort of Seleucid threat reduced, Ptolemy does supposedly turn his attention to just the pleasures of court, he's not a particularly aggressive king. Now, it's notable that after this battle, he does commemorate the battle by putting up a trilingual inscription, the so-called Raphia stele, which depicts him in many ways as a kind of hybrid Macedonian king and Egyptian pharaoh. So it actually shows Antiochus in the position that in Egyptian art is usually reserved for the defeated enemy, as a kind of pathetic bound captive. And of course, Antiochus was not captured in the battle. And then shows Ptolemy very much with the headdress of an Egyptian pharaoh, but riding on a horse as if he is a Macedonian cavalryman. So again, in a kind of hybrid mode. But it's notable here that this battle is sort of reflected, the victory is reflected not just towards the narrow Greco-Macedonian population of clerics and inhabitants of Alexandria, but is also projected towards a native Egyptian audience, as native Egyptians had themselves played an important role in that victory. Now, in the schematic analysis of Polybius, arming those native Egyptians was a terrible mistake, because Polybius believes that those soldiers, emboldened by their training and confident by their success, subsequently rebel. A rebellion that Polybius dates to immediately after the battle, 217, 216 BC. Polybius seems to be wrong here. It may be that there is a minor rebellion, maybe more of even an army mutiny, perhaps shortly after the battle. But it seems that the Egyptian rebellion that does come close to really tearing apart the Ptolemaic kingdom is not really underway until around 206 BC. And of course here our dating is also unsatisfactory, but we know that there's a temple that's under construction, and a inscription in the temple notes that construction was delayed because of the rebellion, and it seems to be around 206 that this delay is taking place. So we do have a native rebellion. It's not impossible that some of the people taking part in the rebellion are veterans of the Battle of Raphia. So Polybius may not be entirely wrong, but the rebellion centers on the Thebaid. So it's up in what would actually be Upper Egypt, because it's upstream of the Nile. But it's actually to the south. The Nile is a very rare river on Earth that flows from south to north. And the rebels essentially establish a native Egyptian state, one that claims to be ruled by a pharaoh, whose name is Horwenifer, Horwenifer is subsequently killed in a Ptolemaic counterattack, but the Egyptians beat the Ptolemies back and subsequently proclaim a new pharaoh, Onkawenifer. Therefore, the Ptolemies lose control of roughly half of their kingdom, at least half of the most important part of their kingdom, namely the Nile. And we're told that the war itself, at least by Polybius, is a extremely brutal war. And the way Polybius describes it suggests that by and large it's somewhat of a guerrilla war. Polybius says this isn't a war of big battles or sieges. It's not a war with a lot of things to report, but nonetheless constant, grinding, brutal violence. And this war will drag on all the way down to 186 BC, when the Ptolemies finally are able to subdue the last of the resistance. So this rebellion from 206 going forward is going to really cripple the Ptolemaic kingdom. It's lost access to those revenues, very important. It's lost access to manpower and resources. This, of course, is going to dramatically weaken the Ptolemaic state. To make matters worse, while this rebellion is going on, Ptolemy IV dies. So now we have a huge, out-of-control native rebellion. We have the death of a king. He's succeeded by his young son, Ptolemy V. And we're told that his ministers take advantage of this situation to basically set up a regency in which they can use this young king. Ptolemy V is basically a puppet. Said that they murder his mother, Arsinoe, to get her out of the way. Maybe she just dies, but she's gone. This might work, except the most respected minister, the best established minister, Sosibus, himself dies. Maybe poisoned, maybe not. And the regency passes to his associate, Agathocles, who proves to be deeply, deeply unpopular. And there is massive rioting in Alexandria. And the rioters effectively depose Agathocles, who commits suicide, and then the rioters tear his sister, Agathoclea, apart in a dramatic, sort of brutal public lynching. And so between this chaotic regency, the fact that you have a child king who just really isn't in position to rule at all, you then have the fact that you have a massive native rebellion, and of course if you're Antiochus the Great, and I made the treaty with Ptolemy IV, he's dead, I guess our treaty's broken, he invades to start the Fifth Syrian War. It's unsurprising that this war, as we talked about in the Seleucids blow by blow, goes very, very well for Antiochus the Great, particularly after he was able to recapture, to capture Coelusyria permanently. He defeats the Ptolemaic army at a major set-piece battle, the Battle of Panion. So now, in addition to all these problems, you have massive losses amongst probably Ptolemaic clerics, where it seems in our military narrative is kind of funky in the way that it survives, but it seems that the Ptolemaic phalanx seems to suffer heavy losses. One more disaster that the Ptolemies don't need. One of the few bright spots that the Ptolemies have is they now have one diplomatic friend who sort of is sticking up for them. And that diplomatic friend is Rome. Not sticking up in a big military intervention, but at least the ambassador is going to talk to Antiochus the Great following the Second Macedonian War, or asking about, why are you being so mean to our, friend, young Ptolemy? And here I think maybe it might be worthwhile just actually casting back a bit. If there is one investment, maybe unwittingly, that Ptolemy II makes, it is an investment in diplomatic relations with Rome. And this takes place in the 270s BC. Ptolemy II has actually been supporting the Epirot warlord Pyrrhus. And the reason he's supporting Pyrrhus, for the most part, is Pyrrhus is doing a really good job chasing poor Antigonus Gonatas out of his kingdom. And since Ptolemy is an enemy of Antigonus Gonatas, supporting Pyrrhus makes sense. But Pyrrhus has some other ambitions and says, I want to invade Italy. Ptolemy says, well, we've had a good partnership. He seems to provide some money and maybe even some troops to support that Italian invasion. Those of you who've taken who are taking 363 know that Pyrrhus's Italian invasion, while he wins some initial battles against the Romans, does not go well in the long run, and the Romans ultimately drive Pyrrhus out in 275. This fact seems to impress Ptolemy II, that it puts Rome on his map, on his mental map, and prompts him, we're told, to establish diplomatic relations with the city. This, as far as we can tell, is the first of the Hellenistic kingdoms that establish any kind of diplomatic relations with Rome. And again, the fact that the Ptolemies are, in a big Aegean power, the fact that they have Cyrene and therefore also look to the west, to Sicily and Carthage, it may not be surprising that they're the first to make that kind of diplomatic connection, possibly a good 50 years before the Seleucids or Macedonia do. But it is actually a really valuable asset because there's now a long tradition of peace and friendship and even cooperation with Rome. It's possible that the Ptolemies loaned the Romans some money during the Second Punic War. At the very least, the Romans mint some coins that seem to have a Ptolemaic-style eagle on them, and this leads some numismatists to wonder if this was the result of a kind of a loan. May not be the only way that the Romans financed the Second Punic War, but again, continues that peace and friendship. And so now, with the Romans, that war ends in 201. But now the Romans afterwards are in a position to actually support the Ptolemies, initially just diplomatically. As we'll see, those interventions will become more aggressive over the course of the 2nd century BC. But as it is, let's leave off. The Fifth Syrian War finally comes to an end in 196. Antiochus, having taken a good deal of Ptolemaic territory, not just in Coile Syria, but also in the Aegean, subsequently signs a peace treaty in which his daughter marries Ptolemy V, so another exogamous marriage, result of in the service of diplomacy. The daughter is named Cleopatra Syrah, Cleopatra the Syrian, and this actually inserts the Seleucid dynastic name Cleopatra into the Ptolemaic line. And so that marriage takes place in 196. And I think that's where we'll leave off. I'll see you next week when we'll talk a little bit about some social and cultural and economic issues. Take care till then.